Hey Ding Dongs, I'm Jamie.
I'm Richard.
And this is Explain It to Jamie, the political comedy podcast in which I, Jamie, a politically innocent but curious young man, have the complicated political happenings of the world explained to him by my politically savvy friend Richard Lamb.
Politically savvy, but sexually idiotic,
Yeah.
which is why we brought back for a three-peat, a hat trick, a Texas triple, a Tennessee also triple, the amazing Steph Baptist.
Yeah.
For a threesome.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Whoa!
We're gonna leave the mics rolling for this one.
Yeah, now we have enough episodes that if all of our sex episodes had sex, it would be considered group sex.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Consensual, I hope. The first one might not have signed up for that, though, right?
That's
no,
true. We'll have to make
they're
sure.
new and young in the world.
Yeah, the first one's technically older than the other ones. I mean, there's all kinds of weird, freaky issues that come up with that. Not to mention the fact that because it is the first one, maybe there's like a hierarchical position of authority that it occupies.
Without a doubt.
Yeah. So we're so happy to have Steph back on to wade into the weedy world of our genitals and the feelings they make us feel. And especially today, we're going to be talking about laws about our genitals
That's
and those
right.
feelings.
Yeah, in many ways, our first two episodes were all of the fun and games where we got to talk about theory and appetite and personal preference and social
The party's
concerns.
over. Our
Yeah.
dicks have graduated grad school, and now they're putting on a tie and punching the clock day in, day out until they finally retire joylessly to a small downgraded house in the suburbs.
Oh my God, and this from a young man who just moved in with his partner and is in his relationship prime.
Yep, the ink is dry, and so is Richard's
That's right.
sexual
His whole
fountain.
life
Yeah.
locked into place. A series of repeating the same gestures over and over, quietly listening to the footfalls of the Reaper coming ever closer.
Oh my God. And from a woman who just celebrated her 19th wedding anniversary last week, may I tell you that sex can get better in ways you cannot even imagine at this stage.
Tell us how.
On our next episode.
Okay, well, we're so excited to have Steph here, and I say let's just hit this theme song and get into it.
Yeah, play that funky jam. Plunk that funky jam.
You definitely were gonna say plunk.
I was gonna say plunk.
because it's like playing funk.
Yeah. I mean, why not start it here?
Yeah.
Plunk it, guys. Plunk that jam.
Okay, so what's our first area of inquisition?
Well, since we're sort of moving into legality, I think we should first officially talk about consent and that kind of thing, because that's sort of I think will be a central feature of each of these examples that we talk about.
Yeah, maximum agree. So I guess like the first question is like, what is actually consent? What does that mean?
Yeah, I hear you. And I'm going to get right to that. But you actually said something in the introduction, Richard, that's really important. It's about feelings. There is a fantastic TED Talk by a sex worker named Jo Mack, is that right? She's British. She's talking about the sex laws that sex workers want, and she talks about our feelings are not how we write laws, but our feelings, especially conservative values, are really informing a lot of laws around sex and sexuality, and it's a wedge issue for a lot of folks. It's very divisive, and I think let's keep that in mind, that keeping people safe with the laws in this country, our feelings have a role to play in that, but they can't make the rules. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to come to feelings because we might need to come back to that as well. Anyway, age of consent, is that where we're going? Or the definition of. That's what we said.
The definition of consent.
I
Yeah.
think because the age of consent you have to understand what consent is to understand why the age of consent is a thing. So why don't we
Fair
start
enough.
there?
Well,
Fair enough.
You had the official def up
Yeah.
on your phone. Do you want to just read that out?
The voluntary agreement to participate in the sexual activity in question.
Right.
That's how it's defined in Canadian law right now. And so you had some problems even with that statement, I think.
Not a problem. It's just I noticed the word voluntary and not consenting agreement. Or not sorry.
You can't use consent to define consent, I guess, is the
but I
part
mean,
of it.
it excludes sale, and because if it's voluntary, it's volunteered. It's not,
You
not
volunteer
without
to,
exchange.
You volunteer to pay your money.
Yeah, I guess
Yeah,
You know
I
what
suppose.
you know
Just
what
like
I'm
a
saying?
transaction is like a contract that both parties enter into, in theory, voluntarily. You exchange a fee for a service.
I suppose.
And that's complicated right there, right? Because somebody will say, well, if I'm paying for it, it doesn't matter if you're okay with it. You know what I'm saying? The worker
Right.
might not like what's happening, but I've paid you for it, and so that is the agreement we've entered into.
I guess then, like,
It's just
the
murky.
traditional counter argument to that would be like, if I hire you to paint my house and then I'm like, also build me a fence, you'd be like, no.
Yeah, for
You
sure.
would do that too with, like, putting the tennis ball in your butt or whatever.
And that's
And
why
I do.
that's why legit transactions have a contract. And because sex work is unregulated, there are no such contracts, and there is no such legal support and safety around the workers and
Right.
their rights to only do the service that we agreed upon at the beginning when you handed me money for a particular service. So yeah, it's murky stuff, and
Right.
the fact that it's not yet decriminalized means we don't have these structures in place to support workers the way we would in any other work
Right.
environment.
Yeah. So now we talked about consent. What's the age of consent?
Yeah. So anyone younger than 12 years of age cannot consent to sexual activity. We know, unfortunately, kids younger than 12 are involved in sexual activity, often with someone who's supposed to be taking care of them. That is, when childhood sexual abuse happens, it's rarely a stranger who has all of a sudden access and opportunity. It's somebody who has ongoing access and opportunity to a young person,
Right.
whether that's a babysitter or a coach or a stepfather or some other member of their family. So just keep that in mind. We're talking 12 years and older. So the age of consent, thanks to the Harper government, or back in 2008, I think, was moved from 14 to 16. The big reason that they talked about at that time was to try to reduce the likelihood of online predators, which was a new version of crime that we didn't hear much about before that, being able to lure children into exploitative relationships with deceptive means on the internet.
Yeah, thanks to Catch a Predator. Thanks, Dateline, right? for getting us that piece of legislation.
Yeah.
And so they know, though, that kids 12 and 13 might be engaged in sexual activity just because their bodies are maturing, puberty's happening, hormones are driving sexual activity. And so they have something called close in age exceptions. So 12 and 13-year-old kids can have sex with other kids who are no more than 2 years older than them.
Yeah,
For
I
example.
remember. I suppose when I was in high school is when that would have been like more relevant to me, I suppose. But I remember that was sort of the rule that was spouted at my school. Was
Yeah.
like, as long if you're 16 and your boyfriend is 18, it's okay. But as soon as he's 19, rules get weird.
Well,
or-
and in fact, 16, you're still okay. The close
'Cause
in
then you
age
pass the age of consent.
Exactly. So close in age exceptions only apply to the 12, 13s and nobody more than 2 years older, and 14, 15, nobody more than 5 years older than you. And always that person can't be in a position of trust or authority. So it can't be a coach.
Can't be a teacher.
Yeah,
whatever,
exactly.
When will there be a government enlightened enough to finally put on the books the half your age plus 7? That's what I want to know. Like, when will years of folk research into an appropriate age to sleep
Richard,
with somebody younger than you finally be recognized
I feel
by
like
law?
I say it too often. Hashtag neoliberalism. Go check out our neoliberalism episode.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Big age of consent laws blocking the enlightened half your age plus 7 based consent laws we need and want in
That's
the world.
right. 1% 80% of the world has 20% of the sex with people that are in improper ages that are,
right.
well, whatever. Whatever that metaphor works out to.
Neoliberalism, math, and sex jokes. Just Mad Libs your own neoliberalism, math,
exactly.
sex jokes.
And then laugh to yourself because it was funny. Damn it, it was funny.
If you're confused about this, listen to our neoliberalism episode, please. Thank you.
That's right. And so, ages. We still have to talk about 16 and 17-year-olds because, yes, they have passed the age of consent, but they're not yet adults. So those folks can be having sex, but we got to be really careful about the exploitative or maybe dependency nature of the relationship. So say a 16-year-old kid comes out and gets kicked out by their family. That unfortunately does happen to a lot of queer youth. So now they're looking for a place to live, and it's with some guy in his 50s, for example. You have a young man, 16, living with a guy in his 50s. I happened to meet a young man recently whose situation was very similar. He was having an awful lot of sex, not only with the guy he was living with, but with other men at the time, and ended up contracting syphilis, but was treated for it before it became really problematic to his health. But in this guy's case, he is 16 and living with somebody who is paying his rent. If there is sexual activity, is it a transaction? Is it consensual? Or are we talking about a young person in a really difficult situation and we are talking about survival sex now? Hard to know, right? And a court, if that ever went to trial, would have to really investigate what was the nature of the relationship, how did it start, and how much of the sex was consensual on behalf of that young person who was not yet an adult, not yet 18.
That's interesting. So even like an economic relationship that's not necessarily like an institutionalized position of power can still potentially be considered a position of power for determining consent for an underage person.
Yeah.
It's also interesting. I've never heard the idea of like a judiciary system weighing whether or not it was for survival. You know what I mean? Like like if someone robbed a convenience store for survival, would they weigh that? And no, they wouldn't.
No, they wouldn't. But in my work in public health, we are always considering the social determinants of health.
Yeah.
There are also social determinants of criminal behavior, right?
I mean, just like Aladdin.
Yes.
That's right, baby.
He steals only what he can't afford, and that's everything.
That's right. And he was such a nice kid. He was just poor.
Dun, 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 dun.
Sing it.
But yeah, like in a way, because a lot of these laws are also newer compared to other laws that we have, like murder laws, we do have a chance to create a kind of like holistic and society-wide approach to the philosophy of how these laws are constructed. You can maybe look at like the larger factors at play in constructing the way the legal system can act on these things.
Yeah, for sure.
We have a chance.
And with consent especially, that's the first time those laws had been changed since 1892. When the age of consent went from 14 to 16.
Whatever Queen Victoria says, that's what you do.
And think of child brides. That whole seems like such an outdated concept, and yet we got to be careful not to kid ourselves that it doesn't still happen. And right here in Toronto, for example, forced marriage is illegal all over the globe, but it's normalized and socially acceptable in a lot of groups, and it can happen right here in Toronto. So I wish I could remember the name of the organization who helps folks in that situation. It's one of those things we can follow up with a link, but forced marriage is absolutely something that happens here. So anyway, but there are always resources, and I guess that's what my job is as the educator, to make sure folks have a link if they know somebody who's in that difficult situation. So we can follow up if you guys put those posts and texts after the podcast goes up.
I would love to do that.
Yeah. And okay, so speaking of our of the youth and their sexual behaviors, I think that's a nice segue into like the new millennial digitized sex world of sexting and sending texts. I was teaching an improv workshop in a high school last winter, and in the bathroom I noticed all over the school were posters about what your rights are and what if you get caught in a situation, what to do, and also what the punishment is for furthering a situation that you shouldn't be furthering. And I remember, it was a little bit of culture shock. 'Cause that
Sure.
wasn't around when I was in high school.
No,
at
for
all.
sure. A lot more conversation about human rights, for sure.
Yeah.
Ontario's own Draw the Line campaign is a really good one about, because it is online, it's part of our conversation, but it's also about sexual assault, which is some of the stuff that's going to have to come up in today's conversation when consent or a lack thereof is up for discussion. But also, prevnet.ca, just in the Give the World resources, it's a really great resource for bullying generally in Canada, but especially the cyberbullying is I think a lot of parents want that information. They're always looking to police officers to come in and do workshops in their school communities to find out more about how do we handle this, how do we make sure our kids are safe online. And the truth is they are given very powerful tools at a very young age, and not necessarily the social awareness and the navigation of relationships piece to make that a safe place. Kids will do appalling things, like anybody might, online that they would not say to somebody's face, right? But they can.
Everyone does. Like,
Totally.
As a video gamer, like the amount of insane shit you hear
the trolling.
playing a video game with somebody, like a children's toy, is wild. Even like me, like I will be much ruder to somebody in a video game if things are going bad
For
than
sure.
I would ever in real life, just because like I don't know, it's so abstract almost. You know what I mean? Like it's hard to humanize somebody who's on the other end of a screen.
Yeah. Well, and there's and I'd like to talk about the sort of malicious examples of that, like sharing photos, of boyfriends/girlfriends that have sent something to you in confidence and stuff like that. But also, one of the things that makes it so scary is the permanence of the internet, and also the like uncontrollable wildfire aspect of like sort of super gossip in our computer age. That can be can have a hand also in less malicious examples of like accidental sharing or accidental, and what's the area of responsibility for something like that as well.
Yeah,
You
for
know what I
sure.
mean?
So the sexting laws talk about intimate images, and those can be shared in confidence and private at one point in a relationship, but we never really know how somebody's hurt feelings when we break up are going to change that behavior, right? And revenge porn is a real thing, where I've got your naked tits in my phone, and they were just for me, and now they're not. Now everybody at school has them. And what used to be one comment about you being a slut on a bathroom wall in your high school, it hurt already.
Yeah.
Now that can be so widespread and feel so impossible to stop. And so there's two last things I should say about sexting before we move away from that. Just that it has to be consensual at any age. So even over 18, right? It's only okay if it's consensual. But even if it was consented to by somebody under 18, a court might want to dig into the circumstances. It's an it depends kind of answer, depending on the nature of the relationship. Even if you consented at the time, the sharing of intimate images might not be okay with somebody under 18. So that needs to be looked at. But if anybody's in this situation and they're stuck with images that are now widespread that they didn't want, needhelpnow.ca is a really great resource to just give them a call. Kids could even call Kids Help Phone and say, what do I do about this? And they'd get the support.
And that's just
supportive
sort of a way to
counseling
get
as
the
well.
ball rolling to getting things taken down, or at the very least limited.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, this happened to me. This was sort of like, when was this? Well, I don't know that I had Facebook at this time even. I was like maybe 22, 23, 21, 22. I had Facebook. But I was talking to a friend of mine who at the time was in like the pickup artist community. And we weren't talking about like pickup things, but we were talking about like social charisma and like how different ways to influence people you're talking to and stuff like that. And a couple months later, I don't remember why, I Googled myself, a little exercise in ego, and I saw my name pop up on this pickup artist website, and this guy quoted me in like the Edmonton forum of the thing, just talking about like the power of humor in making people like you or whatever. And I got very uncomfortable with that because I was
Yeah.
like, I'm not part of this community. I didn't know that I was being like interviewed in this moment. It's not like I said anything totally incendiary. I just really wasn't comfortable being associated. And so I like wrote the person who runs the website and was like,
Wow.
take this down. I don't like that I'm on this website. And like, I eventually like sort of, I didn't threaten to sue, but effectively I said like, listen, I'm working in entertainment, and my agent, who it was non-existent, but like was
Freaking out.
Yeah, freaking out, and you got to take this down, and we're gonna get lawyers involved, and they ended up taking the post down. But I remember it was just this panic, and it's such a minor thing. It's not like I was standing there naked or anything like that, or even that I said anything that bad. But it was like. Yeah, a nightmare. I can only imagine for someone
Exactly.
completely exposed.
Totally.
Yeah.
We are so vulnerable to having our choices taken out of context, and that sucks when you're in an interview and nobody likes it, and that's just your words. Now it's actually my ass on the line, and now what? Now what do I do to get that gone? It's awful.
Well,
it is. It's really vulnerable.
And this is
feeling.
not specifically about sex either, but like, here's a deeply terrifying prospect I want to just put into everybody's head. Mark Zuckerberg is seriously creating the early stages of what almost everybody who's paying attention assumes to be a run for the Democratic presidential nomination. So if you want to fucking keep yourself up all night long, think of the dude who has the keys to everyone's Facebook, everything you've ever tried to delete off Facebook, every message you've ever sent on Facebook, being the president of the United States,
Right.
or even running for the presidency of the United States, because he doesn't have to divest himself from his companies until he's elected.
Right.
Not to mention that fucker knows so much about everybody's like he doesn't need to gather any information about anybody. He has it all.
Right.
About what people believe in, about who to call.
Yeah, who votes for who.
Exactly.
It's
Yeah.
hard to believe there could be a worse candidate for president than the current president, but I guess it's possible.
Yeah.
That's
Oh yeah.
We've
That's
now paved the
creepy.
way for any asshole to run a country.
No.
I hope Kid Rock gets it. He's running for a U.S. Senate seat in
That's
Michigan.
right.
Yeah.
Wow.
Michigan?
I believe
I
so.
thought he was a southerner.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think a lot of people thought that. No, he's running in Michigan. Apparently, he's still popular in Michigan.
Mr.
Wow.
Rock, can you tell us your opinions on climate change? Bow with the bow, da bang, da bang.
No, but
digga,
have you
digga.
not? Okay, this is also definitely not about sex, but have you not? If you have not watched Kid Rock's announcing his candidacy, he raps it. It rhymes. His speech rhymes. It's like a rap, and there's fucking fire. There's like fire that comes out. I'm not kidding. It's
And-
everything you would assume it to be. It is.
And when a
No.
bunch of middle-aged people go on a Kid Rock cruise for a 5-day weekend, you get to dress up nights for pimps and hoes.
Yeah.
And pirates and sirens, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
Cowboy. There's a
Yeah,
cowboy
you
for sure.
think, you
All kinds of
think.
sexy energy. I didn't go on the cruise, but I
Yeah.
outfitted some friends who'd been on one.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Oh my God. Well, yep, it has all descended to bedlam.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Take what you can out of the stores that you like and run for the woods and start chopping wood.
Someone to have sex with.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, find someone to have sex with. Yeah, wow. I think, the online. I mean, this is a great segue. Go check out our Edward Snowden episode, because we talk about the permanence of your online self and how people can manipulate that information. Not this, we sort of alluded to like this, like manipulating of sexual information online, but yeah, we talk a bit more about just the political and economic repercussions.
It applies too because, like, I was thinking a much smaller number of cases of like what's called revenge porn. When sexual images that you've taken end up out of your control in public. To some extent, that does happen from the outside too, especially to like celebrities. People are
Sure.
out there looking to get into their phones, and will just get them and take whatever's on there, right?
Yeah, for sure. The internet has a role in sex work too, in that it's another way, a newer way for workers to find clients and clients to find workers. But that's part of the laws right now around prostitution. Canada, back in 2013-14, adopted what's called the Nordic model, and there's just a whole array of things from full criminalization to complete decriminalization, which New Zealand did in 2003, and that's what sex workers want. Just to make that super clear, like in the whole nothing about us without us, we can't talk about sex work without knowing what workers want. And the New Zealand model of full decriminalization is what they believe will keep them safest. And that to me makes the most sense, right? But in Canada, we have a Nordic model where it's legal to sell your services, but it is illegal to purchase services. There's also a lot of gray area about folks who might be managing a sex worker, also known as a pimp, or somebody running the brothel or the common body house, where the sex workers might get together and, as a way to stay safer, work out of each other's homes so that there's always somebody else down the hall and you're less likely to have to work in isolated areas by yourself. And that's where some of the worst abuses happen. Another piece about it, you yourself as the sex worker can advertise your services, whether that's a weekly like Now Magazine in the back pages or online, but you cannot do that on behalf of someone else. Like you can't agent a sex worker. So the details of the law are really complex, and the folks I know who know them best are sex workers themselves.
That clarifies things a bit. And it's sort of in prep for this last night, I went
drove around.
on Craigslist. Yeah, I drove up and down
around the
Jarvis.
docks.
And,
Just so I could talk to some pretty young thing about what she thought about all this.
I went to Harvey's on Dundas and Jarvis.
And you were like, lovely ladies.
No, I did this digitally and metaphorically. I went on Craigslist.
Manually.
Yeah, I went on Craigslist and I looked at the people that were selling their services, and just to sort of, because you just read the comic book that I lent you.
Paying for it
by Chester Brown, who's a Toronto-based graphic novelist, and he's written this very interesting graphic novel about his personal autobiographical relationship with prostitutes and it was such a, reading it was very culture shock. I guess I still had like a very old school understanding of sex work, imagining the leopard skin vest on the corner of Jarvis and Dundas,
and there's lots of folks still doing street work.
absolutely but the sort of world that he outlined was more civil, more elegant, and more
quite humane.
And so anyway, I was on the classifieds last night looking through, and I was shocked at how many options there were.
Oh yes.
It was it all of a sudden became not such a niche profession in my mind's eye.
It's very widespread.
I realized how
we all know a sex worker. And we all know somebody who buys sex. We just don't know they do that.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
And one thing I just want to say about the humanizing piece, Valerie Scott is another sex worker, one of the ones very important along the lines of Terry Jean Bedford and all the 2013-14 Supreme Court of Canada stuff that was happening. She's got a TED Talk about someone you know is a sex worker, and someone is benefiting from that industry. And her talk is really lovely. She talks about one guy who just came and sort of cried in her arms. That's what he paid her for that night. And he had no one else to give him that touch and that time, and he knew a sex worker could be asked to do that. And I think it is sort of touching how important those exchanges can be.
The prejudice against sex work, mentally and legally, it seems to me such a relic of a bygone era of morality. And I mean, we're at a point right now in Canadian history, certainly, and across the West, where we're sort of relitigating the very imperial and colonial foundations of our society, and sex work's criminalization seems like one of them to me. It seems like the whole reason it's illegal is because back in the day, it was considered immoral. And I think way back in the day, there's a relationship to childbirth and a need to stabilize society that came from childbirth that would cause people to want to like regulate who's having sex with who, at least in public. But now that you can divorce the act of sex to a very, very, very large extent from the risk of accidentally getting pregnant, I don't see, it doesn't make sense at all to me that it's still criminalized, especially since like the fundamental biological needs of all living organisms on like a super primordial level are to like eat and survive and reproduce yourself. So like we have almost everyone, there are asexual people obviously, but like almost everyone feels the need has a sex drive. It's like a very elemental thing that we have. And to give people, to acknowledge that society has a role in helping people like in acknowledging their sex drives, letting them use it, giving them options to exercise it healthily, learn about it, etc. I mean, that does not sound crazy at all to me. That seems like extremely logical.
And yet it's a challenging statement just to say that we are all sexual beings across the lifespan. That is a foundational principle of my work, and I see no challenge there, and yet I know lots of people challenged by that. Well, that means little kids are sexual beings. Yeah, they are. I know that's uncomfortable, but they touch their genitals at nap time at daycare because it feels good. And it's part of their body, just like their elbow. So, but that's a real struggle for folks. They are not raised up on that discussion themselves. It's a real taboo topic, and they don't know how to have those conversations with little kids in their lives. Or, on the other end, older people, the boomers, have always made life what they want it as they came up through the system, and that now means, well, yeah, we're still interested in sex, many of us. And what that might mean is be careful, don't just walk into somebody's room in a long-term care home to give them their meds. Their pants might be down, and one of the other residents might be over for the afternoon, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
And these are things that are going to have to be considered more carefully in our society as more and more of us age, and more of us need those services and are still interested in maintaining a sexual life.
Yeah, a dear friend of mine worked at a retirement home, and one day we were talking, and she says, "Oh yeah, today Trojan is coming to give a talk and a demonstration because they were finding in the Alberta retirement home scene was one of the fastest growing communities of STIs.
STIs.
And
Yep.
so they're like, we gotta teach these old people about condoms because
Totally.
when they were young and single and going to barn dances and stuff, nobody was wearing a condom.
Of course not.
And-
And in fact, CCAN, which is the Sex Information and Education Council of Canada, they are one of the go-to sources of research. They just put out a brief this past winter, and it's all about the needs of midlife and older adults in terms of their sexual health. It has to be a consideration for sexual health educators. It's really, really important priority. And just a couple of things about sex work and the moral piece. There's still so much stigma around it. I don't know how many times when I was on the phone line talking to someone who had participated in the trade, not usually as a worker but as a client, those were more often the folks I would speak to, about, I don't know if she's clean, I asked. But this whole clean and dirty idea that somebody doing sex work is more likely to be infected, more likely to be skanky, whatever other negative words we might put on that person, or more likely to be needy, struggling with mental health issues and addictions and stuff. True, all of those things can happen. They can all be part of sex work. And what we need to remember is that some of them are the smartest people about how often I need to get tested and how to keep myself safe even without condom use, because we're not going to use that in this scene, but we're going to have the conversations that make sure we're both able to have this without transmitting infection to one another. But those aren't very sexy conversations in a lot of videos, right? So we don't see that stuff, but they are actually very savvy about keeping themselves safe. And gay men too, in terms of avoiding HIV infection. Condoms is the public health messaging, but there are alternatives with post-exposure prophylaxis and pre-exposure prophylaxis. There are medication ways, and they call it serosorting, or if you know somebody's status, it might be safer to have sex with you because your viral load is undetectable, and so you're not going to pass it on to me, so we don't actually need to use condoms. So it takes a lot of education to be really informed, and it takes a lot of collaborative conversation, and that's what a lot of us aren't aren't having. It is easier to just have the sex than have the conversation about it. So
yeah, well, it is interesting. I notice when I'm speaking to friends of mine who are in the homosexual community, it is a lot more common, and it is a lot easier a conversation to have about like when the last time you were checked was.
Yep.
How I find a lot of my my gay friends will be more upfront if like, oh my God, I had sex with someone last night and we didn't use a condom and now I have to go get checked.
Yeah.
Whereas I find in more heterosexual situations that conversation A doesn't come up very often.
Yeah.
B, if it does, I don't find people are often super like they don't disclose exactly when they got checked, and also according to most of my heterosexual conversations, nobody ever forgets to wear a condom or ever neglects to wear a condom. Just not out of straight up lying, but out of just not including that information. And I thought I've been thinking about that a lot recently. About it's very interesting that well, I guess it makes sense. I think. Generally, the homosexual community is more sexually aware, and generally guys are out there having anonymous sex maybe a little bit more often.
It's more acceptable in the culture, and so there's more communication around it for sure.
Yeah. And as a result, I wouldn't be surprised at all to see safer practices more
and
often.
Less presumption of monogamy as the thing that keeps you sexually safe as well. So that's why and a lot of condom campaigns advertised toward them because of the AIDS crisis and all of that. So there's lots of reasons why gay folks might be more communicative about this, and also because they are a minority, they know more about the dominant culture than the dominant culture knows about them, right? They have seen it, and they've had to reflect on it because it doesn't fit for them quite the way it does so comfortably for so many people around them. And so most members of a minority, whatever we're looking at, know more about the dominant culture than the dominant culture cares to bother spending time thinking about them.
Right.
Honestly.
Wow. Very interesting. So I want to jump back to sex work a little bit. I don't want to presume to know like how you guys feel about it and like its process in being legalized and that. I've been reading a lot about steroids lately. I don't know why. It's been in my sphere of interest, and I've been watching these little documentaries about these lifelong steroid users
because of all the steroids you're doing.
Because of all the steroids I'm doing, and I figure it's time to catch up with my education as I've got a lot of shit going through my body.
Like you can't see this, but Jamie's actually as big as my apartment building.
Big as a
giant.
Yeah.
He's using a giant's mic.
And I wasn't that big when I got here today, but this has been happening more and more regularly.
It's an Alice in Wonderland steroid. It says,
one
just a big
pill
mushroom
makes
that says,
you
"Eat me."
larger.
But and these are the people I'm talking about aren't professional athletes, which I think is an important distinction, because these are lifelong steroid users who are just doing it for their own aesthetics.
Okay.
They're not competing in professional athletics. I think that raises a few more problems because if you're in athletics and you're using steroids, and the organization doesn't punish or doesn't at least police that, then now there's a pressure on everybody to use steroids.
Sure.
Because otherwise you can't compete. But as soon as you do it in your own personal life, all of a sudden I have a little bit more not patience, that's the wrong word, but a little bit more understanding of do what you want with your body because you're not...
Your body, your call.
Well, I want to interject too to say this is a phenomenal documentary about steroids. I mean, if you Google steroid documentary, you'll find it. It's like the main documentary about steroids. That's like... I went into it because I was like, oh, a documentary, this will be cool. Yeah. And I was expecting it to be like an expose on steroids. But it's actually this really fascinating, like, philosophical... It is like, it shows the dark sides of steroid use, but it also is a really interesting philosophical inquiry into why we are so repulsed by steroids or, like, wary or afraid of them as a society. And, like... to crayon this dude's argument, which is an excellent argument that you should watch. I don't remember what it's called. It's like Steroids, the Steroid Story or something. No, it's called something better. It's got like this quick, witty name. like we allow the use of performance enhancing drugs in virtually all other aspects of high performance, including like classical orchestras. People take beta blockers, which suppress their anxiety. Like the greatest classical musicians in the world, many of them are heavily medicated. Like drone pilots, fighter pilots use tons of adrenalines and stimulants and amphetamines.
Truck drivers and their energy drinks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So why
military guys do those drugs that keep them up for 48 hours?
Yeah, that's right. And so, but I guess, I mean, like part of his argument is that there's like myth that it's like the natural person is the best one, but it's like, but very rarely is that actually the case, and in many cases, everyone is on some sort of a performance-enhancing drug. They're just hiding it slightly better than the other people, or whatever.
Well, and when porn's up for discussion, fake blonde, fake nails, fake tits, fake tan, fake vagina, vaginoplasty to make it perfectly symmetrical and not so flappy aroundy, even though the flappy aroundy flesh is going to serve them really well when they're middle-aged and they're drying out a little bit after menopause. They need that extra tissue to make penetration more comfortable, but they're getting them all cut off and replacing it with scar tissue, which is going to be actually leading to less satisfying sex later in their lives for the sake of the videos they're making now, because there seems to be some public demand for pussy perfection. So,
and to sort of bring to bring this now back to the point of the steroid use being like, if you're not cheating at something, if you're not using it for illegal activities, I kind of go, all the power to you. It's not for me, and usually the guys that are like that have a personality that I feel would grate with my personality in a real life situation. But I feel like
and have an impact on how they have sexual relations. Sure. How they feel naked. All that stuff.
And I kind of mirror that to the sex work thing and I don't know, maybe I'm totally out on the wrong branch, on the wrong tree, but I feel like as long as things are safe and consenting and controlled in some way, I feel like, I don't know, it is only stigma and only public perception that gets in my way of fully accepting the idea of sex work as it, unionized sex work.
For sure.
You'd have in some countries in Europe.
For sure.
Well, I do know a sex worker. I've worked in the theater with someone who is also a sex worker, and I think from talking to her, she's lucky to come from the 1% of sex workers, not the high-powered escort thing, but she works in a dungeon where they do not have penetrative intercourse, but they do all kinds of other bonded BDSM things, and she has a lot of infrastructure behind her, very clearly defined contracts. She feels extremely well treated and empowered, and it's very much like a place of employment and a stable situation and a community for her. And that's the kind of world that I think you would probably hope for all of these people.
And
all sex workers.
This TED Talk that I mentioned, that's exactly what her closing point was. The question is always, well, would you want your daughter doing it? She said that's not the right question. If your daughter was doing it, if she needed to do it because she had rent to pay, if she chose to do it because it was a great way to pack away money while she was studying, how would you like her to feel at work? What could you do to keep her safer at work tonight? And you are just describing somebody who's got that situation. She's outnumbered, there's no doubt. There's a lot of folks. There's some really important research projects going on in Toronto right now looking at older sex workers, primarily from mainland China, might not even speak enough English to navigate the system. They don't have status. They are working in hotels and spas, and they are very, very vulnerable. And so there are lots of folks almost being trafficked, right? People smugglers are absolutely a thing too, but I think we hear more about that than we do about the folks who just actually going to work, having great relationships with their colleagues, actually have some really nice regulars, and haven't felt unsafe at work in a long time.
Yeah, her main complaint was that the woman whose dungeon it was given it to her by her wealthier boyfriend, and even though she had only been in her words, the hoe business for a couple of years. She was everyone's boss, and that was annoying.
It would be annoying.
Yeah,
It would be
yeah.
annoying. I was in a workshop with an old hoe, quote unquote, her words,
Yeah.
just this past week, and she just made a great joke about the financial component of sex. But yeah, if you're going to call yourself a hoe, you have at it. In group humor, you go to town. But I think stigma is absolutely the reason the rest of us shouldn't be using the term.
And to put on the normal hat that I usually wear on this podcast a little more too, I think it's probably worth saying that to come at it from the other angle and say, if we have a society where we have a good minimum wage and minimum social protections so that nobody falls below the line of poverty and everybody has health care and everybody, has access to housing, you will probably get far fewer people forced into sex work in order to just make the money they need to survive. If survival is not a desperate part of the equation of existing in our societies, I think you will see more empowered sex workers also, because for many people they will not need the last resort of turning to unregulated, extremely high-risk sex work.
Yeah, for
agreed.
sure.
Agreed.
I was shocked that on the classifieds I was looking at last night, the rate was like $500 for an hour or something like that.
It's high end, I think.
I suppose so. I remember like reading it and going like
turbo
whoa!
sex.
Yeah, that is expensive. Like that's not like just that's a couple weeks paycheck.
Well, this is just it. Am I going to turn a couple of tricks, or am I going to work my 8-hour shift at a grocery store? Like, you can understand why folks make the decisions they make, right?
I started thinking. I was like, holy cow, $500. Like, I mean, I guess you have to have sex with someone that you maybe wouldn't have sex with regularly, but
For sure.
for $500, guys.
Well, and that was another point that came up in the TED Talk, that for sure we can generalize that most sex gets sold to men with money from women without enough. Mm-hmm. There is a general truth that fuels that industry. Yeah. Absolutely. So let's keep those women as safe as possible, knowing there will be this human demand for sexual services. And you talked about childbirth at one point. It's like, that might be exactly when a guy goes to the industry for the first time. He is not getting any touch at home. This new baby has taken up all the space, and a female partner who's not interested in being touched right now by anyone other than the nursing infant. That might be when you go to a sex worker. And if that helps your family get what everybody needs at this time, and it's just a temporary outlet, we all have our own way of thinking about whether that's harmful or not, right?
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, I was watching or listening to a podcast.
Wait, will there be a sex control board of Ontario? Will there be like
the SCBO?
Because there's going to be like the weed control board of Ontario.
Well,
that's
sure.
coming. That's how they're going to do it. They announced that at just a couple.
Pot
last
dispensing.
week. Right. It's going to be like the LCBO model used for weed. So I imagine if we legalize it, they'll probably do the same thing. They'll tax it.
Oh, those poor dispensaries that let off the base for nothing.
Yeah.
I was listening to this podcast the other day where they were talking with the scientists. You ever hear that famous experiment where they took the college students and put them in like prison-like
Stanford prison experiment.
Yeah,
yes.
They're talking about. So they took some students and assigned them numbers, and they were prisoners. And they took other students, and they were the prison guards. And they set the stage for them over a weekend to live the lives of prisoners and live the lives of guards. And like things descended, and they had to pull the ripcord on it and eject it after a night because it was It turned.
They went rogue.
Yeah,
it was a psychological experiment about the effect of being institutionally empowered over other people.
Interesting.
And the effect that being told you are in a position of power over somebody and that person is inferior has on your own actions.
Yeah, and this guy in the
How
podcast.
interesting for sexual dynamics.
Very interesting. He was talking about the symptoms not the symptoms, like the present circumstances that can lead ordinary people. Like these are not bad.
They were like students.
They're
They were like
students.
universities. All of them were
Yeah,
university students.
What
the-
decade was
The
this?
60s.
Yeah.
I believe, maybe the 50s.
Unethical now probably wouldn't pass the board, but whatever.
Might even be more recent than that.
No, it's not. It's
Really?
that old. Yeah, let me Google, but I'm almost positive it was the 60s.
Well, but anyway, he was talking about the circumstances that led these seemingly normal people to do these horrible things, and he was saying, they were alluding to like Guantanamo Bay, like in
Nazi Germany,
Nazi
and
Germany,
Jewish
these-
people who were guarding other Jewish people in concentration camps.
Yeah.
You were right, 1971.
Yeah, and one of the circumstances, or a few of the circumstances, one of which was anonymity, is like if that is present, I have no one's going to come down on me, and another one is dehumanization. So if we give them numbers instead of names, now all of a sudden, and I'm anonymous, and I have authority, plus the privacy. Now all of a sudden, some real bad stuff can happen really quickly, despite me being a totally otherwise moral and quote unquote normal
Law-abiding
person.
citizen.
Exactly. So you can imagine in a situation in which you are anonymously contacting a sex worker,
A hooker. So let's dehumanize her and give her nasty language
exactly,
to
yeah. So
dehumanize
you're calling
her.
a prostitute. You
Yeah.
are paying them for a service. You are doing it in private. All of a sudden, that's 3 of like the 6 circumstances that he outlined
For
just
abusive
right there,
behavior.
right there immediately, and
Yep.
that's also not taking into account the person's previous track record with people, or
Yep.
like previous track record with sex.
Yep.
That adds a new element as well. So it's an incredibly dangerous
Totally.
situation just by virtue of existing in that circumstance.
There's an organization in Toronto who works with young people who have been charged with sexual offenses. And what they find more often than not with these young, primarily males, is that they weren't looking for images of naked children before their crime happened. They just had access and opportunity. They were asked to babysit some little neighbor, and all of a sudden, nobody's around, and there's this little body, and they do things that I don't think they, planned on. They didn't. They're not necessarily worried in some cases that this is a pedophile waiting to happen, right? And some obviously have a history of abuse themselves, so they have really uncomfortable relationship with boundaries. A lot of folks have a hard time navigating that in relationships after a history of sexual abuse. So anyway, there's access and opportunity can bring anybody into a place they might surprise themselves how they treated somebody. And I think a lot of masculinity campaigns right now, whether that's through White Ribbon or some of the other organizations, helping men to sit with the hurt and the harm they've caused as sexual partners, because they've been raised on this, I have more power than you, and here's my opportunity to sort of test that and see how it feels.
Yeah.
And really hard to be honest about that in most situations after the fact.
And the result of that can open in a dehumanization as well. Very similar. I have a friend who works as a counselor for men that have sexually assaulted people, and I was very interested when he started talking about that, because I had never really considered that before. That there are people living with that on the other side who've done something horrible that they can't shake the guilt of, and they need help managing that. And the dehumanization of a rapist, also dehumanization of a victim. Like you are this thing. You're not a person. You're this other thing, and all of a sudden you could be trampled over by.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then you finally have the courage to report what happened, and the incident goes to court, and it still doesn't get punished by a sentence that means anything. Like the what gets reported is already the tip of the iceberg. What gets punished and in our system is such a small percentage of the number of violent or sexually unwanted incidents that happen all over the world, right? Anyway, it's a tricky one, and I find I often educate toward pleasure, that it's not just about the prevention of unwanted sex or STIs or unwanted pregnancies, it's about the promotion of pleasure. But many people are not raised on that model. That is not what sex is for. Sex really is why you got married, and it's to make your children. That is truly what motivates some people's sexual choices. So we can't know how diverse people's reactions to sex are going to be, and it's fraught terrain when it comes to disagreement.
Yeah. This is I don't want to say a nice segue, but sorry, go ahead.
Actually, I was going to ask, like, do you as a sexual health educator, as somebody who talks to people a lot about this, do you have optimism about like the incoming generation of people? I assume, I would guess you have a lot more contact with people who are younger who are learning this stuff. And I mean, what you were describing earlier on this episode about the messaging in schools right now, we never had anything like that, when we were in high school 10 or 12 years ago. But it does make me think of like the messaging around smoking in my generation, which was very different from the messaging around smoking, I think, probably in previous generations. Like, as opposed to, I'm sure, like in the 80s kid generation they got like the Nancy Reagan, right? Like, say no to drugs kind of thing. But we got the like, here's a diseased lung getting fat squeezed out of it commercials. And I think that they did a bit of a number on all of us.
Yeah,
like, I think that we recreationally smoke a lot less than the generations that came before us.
For sure we do. And bike helmets and seat belts, all of those things are the result of public health campaigns that now seem like a no-brainer to us. But generations ago, nobody was wearing seat belts in cars, whatever. So I think the example that comes to mind to answer that question is about queer communities. So more and more people know what LGBTQ2S stands for than ever before. That said, do young people questioning their gender identity or sexual orientation still feel the terrible effects, the scary effects of stigma? Absolutely. It's still punishable by death in 10 countries on this planet to be gay, and illegal in other ways in up to 75, I think. It's crazy how not okay it is to be gay in some places. But in Canadian society, where same-sex marriage has been legal since 2005, I think a lot of kids, my kids' age, are growing up with, being gay is a no thing, whatever. And it doesn't cause the ruckus that it would have to like in my parents' generation here in Canada.
Yeah, I mean,
So I do feel some optimism, I guess, that I feel the evolution in many ways being very positive, and it keeps the fire lit in me to keep doing the work, not to tell people how to be, but to recognize that you're wherever you are in your worldview and your values from your family of origin, and hopefully we can have a conversation that doesn't have to be conflicted. You can see it your way, I see it my way, and we're all doing this for the ultimate sexual health of the young people that are in our lives.
Yeah, I was listening to the Joe Rogan podcast earlier this week, which for all intents and purposes is a pretty bro-y podcast.
Yeah, okay.
But they were talking about they do a lot of talking about mixed martial arts and stuff like that. And on the podcast they were talking and not joking, they were talking about how awesome it would be and how much of a success it would be if they had like a legitimately talented MMA fighter who is openly flamboyantly gay. And they're like, wouldn't that be awesome? And they're like, this would be good, and it'd be such a they're getting into it. I remember listening to it and thinking like, what a this is
not a conversation that would have happened 15 years
these
ago.
Are not the bros that I went to high school with. You have to have different reasons. If you want to criticize them, you have to have different reasons because they're pretty progressive as far as homosexuality and alternative sexual lifestyles go.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
for sure. I do have optimism. I think I have to. I've got colleagues who are very discouraged. They've been in the schools the whole time the new curriculum was being unrolled, and there was so much controversy and so much of it unnecessary. It was based on misunderstandings of what that curriculum was about. Yep. That curriculum's not that progressive. Thank goodness it caught up. Yep. Ontario's needed an update very badly, but it just... nobody's going into school and showing kids how to have anal sex in grade 1. Like, there are just so many misunderstandings about what's happening.
Yeah.
And I said this before in this podcast, it is the most responsibly researched piece of pedagogy I think this province has ever unveiled.
Yeah.
But anyway, it causes controversy, but I have a lot of reason for optimism, because I think young people can come to a lot of this with an understanding of their bodies and their own natural drives. And it's just these values that they keep hearing from their adults that slow them down and unfortunately sometimes wreck sex for them, right? And cause them some big, big hang-ups just about having an erection. It's okay, it's part of your body, enjoy it.
Right.
But it's not that simple. The psychology around it for some folks is very challenging. And in fact, it comes right back to sex work. One young guy I talked about said, yeah, my first trip to an escort was not fun. I lost my erection even before the condom package got unopened, just so much nervous energy that made it less fun. But his second encounter was really fun. And so I think, anyway, I could go on and on and on, and yet I'm not talking about our concept of consent right now.
Oh, that's
so
okay.
maybe we need to decide what our next episode's about.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
We'll get you back on for I don't know, what's a 4-person, like a wife swap.
A full swap. There you go. Episode 4 is a full swap.
Yeah. Before we pull the plug completely, I would like to talk a little bit about drug-facilitated sexual assault. That's sort of the last thing on our list.
Yeah.
Before we go free range. But
Yeah,
I
for
think,
sure. It's a big one in the media, right? There's
Yes.
cases all the time. Did you want to describe the one that you had talked about in Nova Scotia in the taxi?
Yeah, I was one of the things I wanted to talk about was back in March. There was a lot of news because there was a sentencing, or rather a lack of a sentencing, in a rape case in Halifax where, like, a woman had taken a cab home from being out at the bar, was so drunk that she had, like, pissed herself. Like, she was like not really coherent. I think her friends, or she had gotten herself in a taxi, and the police, like, found the guy pulled over in the cab, have the cabbie, like, with her pants off, like, in the back seat,
And his own undone.
and his own pants were off and stuff. And the judge in the case ended up saying you could not demonstrate that there was no consent, and that a drunk person can give consent. And it, like, basically put the burden of proof on her to prove that she was so drunk she could not give consent in this case.
Right.
It's come up in Toronto recently, too, where 3 Toronto police officers were not charged of a sexual offense when a young parking enforcement officer new to their team had been out on rookie buy night. It was the rookie's job to buy drinks for the older officers, and she was in a hotel room with 3 officers. None of us know exactly what went on there, but we do know that the burden of proof was for her to prove that she had not consented to this, and it was all clouded by alcohol and incapacity, and we gotta acknowledge the power dynamic. 3 male officers who are already in the job, and a young female who's just joined the team. Like, anyway, our whole system is still not serving victims very well. It's doing a lot of victim blaming and slut shaming and not believing stories. I don't understand why we don't think, well, of course that was a sexual assault. I mean, it happened so widespread that how can we even doubt that it was? But anyway, I come from a unique perspective as a sexual health educator, so I see these systems differently, I guess, than most. But yeah, we have a lot of work to do just based on sexism and the power differential in a lot of sexual relationships. But people talk about Rohypnol and GHB and ketamine as date rape drugs, but we got to remember that alcohol has been facilitating sexual assaults for a very long time. And what is the difference between, yeah, my girlfriend's coming over, we're going to get high and get laid together. That's the point, is to, get high and get busy. Where does consent have a role there? Well, if that's never going to come to a charge or a trial, then it's a non-issue, I guess. This is just how we have dates on the weekend. But a lot of unwanted sex has happened when folks have been too drunk to say no. And so I guess what we need to end on is this idea that consent isn't anymore about no means no. The way we talk about it is yes means yes, and it's enthusiastic consent, and it is ongoing. And at various stages in the process, we are just touching base with our partner to say, are you still into this? Like, I know we were good with our clothes off, but are you good with my hands on your genitals? Are you good with my mouth near your ass? Or whatever. Every step of the way
You don't need
requires check-ins.
Consent is not the absence of a no; it is the presence of a yes.
Yeah,
right?
for
It's not-
sure.
If they haven't said no, that doesn't mean you have consent. You have to hear them actually say yes.
And consent to coming to dinner is not consent to getting laid.
Right.
And consent to taking our clothes off together is not consent to being penetrated. You know, we got to break it down step by step. And I think people
And just because they're dating you doesn't mean they want to have sex.
totally
with
just
you.
because you're
And-
married, like there are
Yeah.
guys who've said very infamously in U.S. courts, well, you can't rape your wife. I beg to differ.
Yeah.
You sure can. Wives get raped by their lawful partners all the time.
Yeah.
And it happens in same-sex relationships too. Intimate partner violence is absolutely something that happens in same-sex couples because there are power differentials in any pair of people, right? And so, yeah, we just have to recognize that consent can be very sexy, actually, too. You know, the where we're going next, and are you good with that? And the check-ins can be really fun. I wish there wasn't so much negative energy around it being a buzzkill, because I think it can be a real turn-on, actually, those conversations.
And I wonder if a lot of the perception of it being a buzzkill, that's, I've mentioned this before on a sex episode, but I once did a sexual education school tour of like a theater show. And
Great.
that's actually one of the main things, because there's a section about consent in that show. And when we were talking to grade 9 students, the main thing is like, oh, what if it ruins the mood? You know, like, I wonder
rape ruins the mood pretty well, too.
Well, I wonder if the problem is that if you're a young person and you're exposed to porn, or you're exposed to even just like Hollywood, there's not a lot of actual representations
Nobody sees
of
this.
consent
Yeah.
on TV, on film, or
No.
in porn, right? You never see somebody, you never see a model. You never see a model, and so you never see a sexy model
No.
of good consent.
Yeah, exactly. There's I forget the film, but it stands out in my mind as a great pre-sex scene because they're talking about all the other partners they've had. They aren't talking about testing history, unfortunately, but that's the kind of place where you could have that conversation. I know a lot of people want to avoid that like the plague too. Well, you don't talk about their exes. That'll just get us both riled up. It's like, no, that's how you'll find out what they like or what they don't want any more of. Because I used to do that and it didn't work out for me or whatever.
Inform you a bit more about the partner that you are having sex with.
Totally. But again, it comes back to just any conversation about sex for many, many people is harder to have than the sex itself.
Yeah, I feel like, well, especially recently, as I feel I'm getting older. You know, I think, and as me and Richard have said to each other before, you know, like, you know, we're almost 30. I've had sex now. You know, I don't need to like prove to myself and my
got
friends
this.
and other people that I can have sex.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, it's become, and also obviously my hormones have slowed down a little bit. There's a little less urgency.
A little bit.
But I'm more happy, and also my friend group has become more diverse in the sexual world as well, and so I have different kinds of conversations. But I've become aware of how I was doing what my relationship has been to the minimum amount of effort to have sex, especially early on in my young adulthood, of like university level, of like what's the least resistance way to have sex with someone fully consenting, but like, to get myself in a sexual relationship with this person. And now I'm understanding that, you know, I've very good, comparatively, sexual communication, and I'm realizing how every situation that I've had in my life could have been much richer with a little bit more of a. I heard recently the parents being told to teach their kids and teach their sons specifically the idea of, if you don't have sex tonight, it's okay. You know, like just even thinking about that, even hearing that when I was in high school would have changed my relationship to going to parties and things.
And
you
maybe
know?
in our sexualized culture that sex is just for fun. That's the only reason to have sex. Agreed. We have sex for pleasure. That is how most sex in the world happens, is for pleasure. But that doesn't mean there's no work to it. It's like any human interaction. Sometimes you have to work not for it, but with it a little bit, right? Like any relationship requires some difficult stuff, and maybe that's also fueled by the divorce rates in our country. Yeah, as soon as it gets boring, I'm out of here. Rather than, maybe we're just having a boring 18 months, and we're going to talk about it and find some ways to get back to where, and folks might find the relationship, like I kind of implied as a person married 19 years, can get better than you ever imagined in ways you didn't even know about when you first got married. So our willingness to ride the waves of a relationship is pretty minimal, I think. There's that instant gratification. If it's no fun, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes you're going to get better fun if you invest a little harder work.
That's right.
You know?
That's right.
You know what movie has a good sex scene?
Hmm.
Deadpool. That's one of the best ones I can think of.
No!
Yeah, have you seen that movie?
No!
Deadpool has this like really hilarious and very fun sex montage.
Oh, I love
It's one of the
it.
most like positive representations of sex I can think of.
Oh, I will so
Yeah.
check that out.
I do know what you're talking about. That is a good scene.
Yeah.
Young people fucking is a good movie for that.
So
Yeah,
it
yeah.
should be.
Yeah. What is it? It's like pretty much like the sex-based Love Actually.
Yeah, that's right.
You know?
Canadian
the Canadian
sex-based
sex-based Love
Oh,
Actually.
I love it.
Well, the
Yeah,
bulldog
it's pretty
snores.
good actually. I really liked it a lot.
Bulldog snores have ratcheted up, so why don't we gently throw the checkered
She's
flag?
she's giving us a hint that we are
Yeah.
boring everybody
Yeah,
now.
sounds good. This we did originally conceive of this as like a trilogy series, but we're obviously enjoying ourselves, and the numbers are showing you're enjoying yourself.
Yeah, so
Hey.
we're going
So-
we're going the Alien series on this one. First, we're gonna do a fourth one unexpectedly, and then some weird prequels, some really freaky prequels.
Yeah,
Maybe
yeah.
listeners can tell you what they want to hear more.
Yeah, that's
about.
right. Hey, if you have questions, topics you want, literally questions, like let's advice column this. Like, if you want to
Done.
ask Steph some questions about
Done.
sex.
Yeah.
Please let us know. Send us an email, explaintojamie@gmail.com. Tweet at us, or send us a DM at twitter.com/explainjamie. Instagram
Or
DM us.
tweet about it publicly if you want all of the internet to weigh in on it.
Yeah, that's
as well,
right,
Like
yeah.
a very personal and scary question.
We have a Facebook page, Explain to Jamie. You can message us,
Yeah.
leave a comment on our SoundCloud, or message us on SoundCloud.
We're on Instagram. We're all over the internet, guys.
Just do some work.
just
Haven't
do-
you
yeah.
learned anything from this podcast?
That's right.
Your relationship with us. Put some effort
Enrich
in.
your relationship with Jamie and Richard.
That's right. Is there before we go? Is there anything? Do you have any events or anything like that you'd like to plug? Any resources that you'd like to recommend?
Yeah, nothing that hasn't already come up. Sex with Steph is on hiatus still. Hopefully to be resumed in the fall, but yeah, unfortunately no dates that I can pass on to listeners at this point. But
All good.
We'll
Sex
keep
with
them
Steph has a
updated.
Facebook page as well, and a meetup, meetup.com. You'll find Sex with Steph there as well. So yeah, that's about it, I think. For a conversation that could go in 8 million directions, I think we wrapped it up pretty nicely, and I do look forward to episode 4, whatever that'll be.
Great.
Yeah, sounds like a dream. Until next time, I'm Jamie.
I'm Richard.
I'm Steph.
This is Explain It to Jamie.